I think so.
Okay.
Good?
Sorry.
So folks, we're prepared to get started with our next panel of the day. I think the previous panel on legislative options was pretty dynamic and laid out a number of issues germane to the Iran nuclear issue. And one thing that's come up in all these different panels on U.S. policy and both implications for the region is the issue of human rights. And so we've dedicated this next panel to a discussion really specifically of the human rights landscape in Iran. And I think that we have a rather fantastic panel lined up for you all. First, it's my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Giulio Terzi. Ambassador Terzi is a UANI senior advisor and former foreign minister of Italy. He joined Italy's foreign service in 1973 and then served his country in a number of appointments, and I'll just list them off because it's a pretty impressive list. Paris, Ottawa, Vancouver, NATO, the United Nations, as ambassador to Israel, then the United States, and finally as Minister for Foreign Affairs. Since March 2016, Ambassador Terzi has served as president of the Global Committee for the Rule of Law, which aims to promote the full affirmation of human rights worldwide. Staff and leadership of UANI can attest personally that there is no bigger, a more eloquent and ardent advocate for human rights in the world than Iran than Ambassador Terzi, and we're very, very proud to have him on our board. Our next panelist is the Honourable Irwin Cotler, who's the founder and chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights and former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. An international human rights lawyer, Professor Cotler has served as counsel to numerous prisoners of conscience, including Andrei Sakharov and Natan Sharansky, Nelson Mandela, and numerous many others. He has received multitudes of awards and honorifics for his service to his country and for his work on behalf of human rights, and we are exceptionally fortunate that he was able to join us here today. Our next panelist is Ambassador Jackie Wolcott. She serves as Commissioner for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and formerly U.S. Special Envoy for Nuclear Nonproliferation. Prior to joining the Commission, Ambassador Wolcott had a long career in government executive positions, Special Envoy for Nuclear Nonproliferation and U.S. Ambassador to the UN Security Council, Ambassador and U.S. Perm Rep to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, U.S. Governor to the IAEA Board of Directors, where she worked on issues related to Iran and North Korea's nuclear weapons program. Given her unique history and experience working on both non-proliferation issues and human rights, you can see why we were very, very pleased that she agreed to join the UANI board this year. We're very, very proud to have her part of our organization. And finally, our moderator for this event is Barry Rosen. Barry Rosen served as the press attaché in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and was one of 52 Americans held under brutal conditions for 444 days during the Iran hostage crisis. Barry and his colleagues have spent nearly 4 decades fighting the Algiers Accords agreement that gave the hostage-taking regime in Tehran immunity from any lawsuit by the long-suffering men and women of the U.S. Embassy. On his return to the U.S., Rosen took up the position of assistant to the president of Brooklyn College, CUNY. He wrote The Destined Hour about his experience in Iran. While serving as executive director of public affairs at BMCC here in New York, Mr. Rosen became a leading voice in calling on the Obama administration to reject the diplomatic visa of Hamid Abu-Talebi as Iran's new ambassador to the UN in March 2014. He holds graduate degrees from Syracuse, Maxwell School of Public Affairs, and Columbia University's Department of Middle East Languages and Cultures. Please welcome our panel up to the stage. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's an extreme pleasure on my part to head this panel, moderate this panel, because it really does have some personal impact on my life. I spent 444 days in captivity in Iran from 1979 to 81. And human rights is something that is near and dear to my heart, especially human rights in Iran. We're going to talk about the human rights landscape in Iran today. For sure, the landscape has grown steadily worse since the JCPOA was signed in 2015. Executions, especially for drug-related offenses attended by large crowds, including children, continue at a high rate in Iran. Other speakers have talked about what Amnesty International accounted for 55% of all recorded executions around the world took place in Iran in 2016. 1/5 of those dealt with Kurdish prisoners. At least 78 juveniles still remain in death row. The first 6 months of 2017, 239 people have been executed in Iran. In her March 2017 report, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran, Asma Jahangir, urged governments to stop arbitrary arrest of journalists and bloggers and found that torture and flogging remain prevalent in Iran. She also mentioned former presidential candidates. Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi had spent 6 years under house arrest without charge. She was particularly concerned about the limited progress made towards discrimination against women and girls and highlighted that child marriage had spiked, with 17% of all the marriages involving young girls marrying old men. She deplored the arrest and persecution of the Baha'i community in Iran. And only yesterday, I just found out, Dateline, Monday the 18th, that a Baha'i leader was released from prison after 10 years, and 6 other Baha'i leaders remain behind bars. Mahvash Sabet was finally freed, but state-led persecution of the Baha'i community continues. Also, on the same date, I learned that a member of the Iranian labor union movement is on a hunger strike. His name is Reza Shahabi, and that took place on a news broadcast yesterday. For more than a month, the labor activist has been on a hunger strike at Rajai Shah prison near Tehran. He has also refused medicine. On Wednesday, prison officials agreed to allow his family to visit, the first time in years. Let's not discount also those Americans and others, dual nationals who have been taken prisoner in Iran for the last several years. So with that, I'd like to ask my panel, each member of a panel, to discuss within several minutes your take on human rights within Iran. I think we'll start with Ambassador Terzi, then Professor Cotler, and then Ambassador Wolcott.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rosen. Let me say how humbled I am to attend this panel and to speak in front of such an important audience with so many people, experts, and important players on international scene in foreign policy and in other aspects of security policy on the Iranian issue. I would like to express my gratitude to Senator Joseph Lieberman, Ambassador Mark Wallace, and all the leaders of this community, which is UANI, and in particular glad to speak at a panel where Ambassador Wolcott and Dr. Cotler are the really important voices on human rights. Being an European and an Italian, and since I represent perhaps a strange animal in this American environment, and being an European generally here in the United States, but in other parts of the world, you don't need particularly to increase that kind of criticism, which is quite diffused vis-à-vis the European foreign security policy and the role that Europe is exerting in the world in comparison to the role that such an extraordinary economic reality, cultural reality, and so important for a cultural legacy that it has in the world. Europe, in fact, is often criticized for this lack of presence, lack of attention to the most critical areas of the geopolitical reality. But being an European who has devoted large part of his diplomatic career to the issue of human rights and to the issue of security together, I cannot but refrain from admitting that we Europeans, vis-à-vis Iran, are not following the right policy at this very moment. And we continue to give wrong signals, not only to the world in general, but specifically toward Iran, because we tend to put as a first priority the need to increase our economic relationship, our trade, our economic presence, our businesses in this sort of a new El Dorado which has opened up with the JCPOA, or at least an El Dorado which is very present in the narrative that all European governments are presenting to their public opinion and to their business community. And this is even more worrisome because if you look at the fundamental text of the European Union and the European Union identity, texts which are enshrined in the legacy of whatever Europe means in terms of identity, and the willingness to be present on the world scene, it's very easy to understand that we are not acting along the lines which have been commonly agreed, even in the formal treaties. The Treaty of Lisbon, Article 2, says very, very clearly that the foreign European security policy has to be focused first and foremost on the support of the rule of law, on human rights, on fundamental freedoms, support that has to be implemented and granted and implemented within the European Union, be it in the relationship between member states among themselves, but also in an equally important priority, it has to be implemented in foreign relations with other partners. And this is not only in the major framework of the Lisbon Treaty, but that is written also in an incredible number of decisions by the European councils and the subordinate bodies. The European Council are the top political level where a decision is undertaken by the head of government, and by the subordinate bodies, foreign ministers, Minister of Interior, Minister of Justice, when they have time and again, more than once per year, I would say, established guidelines for the freedom of religion and belief, for the status of women, for the condition of children, against human trafficking, and so on, against torture and unacceptable behavior vis-à-vis inmates, and so on. So when we look at Iran, and when we read the joint communique or the reports about political meetings between Europeans and the Iranian authorities, or when we look at the position taken at the United Nations, even the Security Council, we'll see that too often, almost always, the question of human rights, it is raised sometimes in a with very shy attitudes, or it is sometimes totally neglected. And therefore, it is very important that we address this issue on how our countries, the United States and Europe, can change tack somehow in this strategy, because we have to come back forcefully to the issue of human rights as an issue which must have a leverage and a conditionality on our relationship with Iran across the board, not only outside the JCPOA, but also as an element which must be a filter for consideration on how Iran is behaving with its own population. The Iranian regime is behaving with its own population, but also with the population nearby, with how it behaves in Syria in fighting against terrorism, or how it is a positive or negative actor, and we know very much that it is a very negative actor on the situation in Iraq. I would like just to conclude this first part of observation by noting that while the attitude and the performance of European governments, at least some of them more than others, the performance is not positive, regretfully. The attitude by the civil societies and by the parliaments is more positive. And I would like just to mention two examples here. 310 members of the Italian Parliament, a couple of months ago, signed a letter appealing to the Italian government that the massacre of 1988 political opponents in Iran, because of a fatwa issued by Ayatollah Khamenei, be investigated by an independent international commission of inquiry, and that the people who still occupy very high positions, there are at least 7 of them, who have high roles in the Rouhani administration, that these people, these high officials of the Iranian government, be prosecuted and be kept accountable by the international community and an institution and an international body, which could be the International Criminal Court or some other panel or committee. So this is the first point, and it shows that the Italian Parliament, but also other parliaments, the UK Parliament, there is a group of Nobel Prizes who have signed similar documents. The European Parliament moved in the same direction, more or less in the same time, just before the summer, with a good number, a few hundred parliamentarians who signed the same appeal. The second case I would like to mention is the case of accountability, which has to be requested to the Iranian authorities and the Iranian regime for what has been happening in Syria. This is also a question of human rights. It's not a question of transitional justice, because we are in the realm of war crimes and therefore more international law. But in Syria, what the Iranian militias, supported by the Russians, the Russian aviation in particular, did in Aleppo has to be considered a war crime. And there is a wonderful book and a wonderful analysis by a prominent jurist, Sherif Bassiouni. Dr. Bassiouni has been the leader of many UN commissions. It's very clear on that. These are war crimes for which the Iranian regime and the Iranian supporters of the Iranian regime must be held accountable. Thank you.
You know, what's very interesting in terms of the 1988 prisoners, Ahmad Montazeri, the son of the former Ayatollah Hossein Ali Montazeri, who was arrested by Khomeini, has also been put under arrest for bringing up the situation of the 1988 prisoners.
Yes.
That just came up through a UN report. Attorney General Cotler, can you talk about your view of the landscape in a few minutes?
Yeah, I'm going to link up exactly where former Mr. Terzi not only left off, but the basic themes of his remarks. I want to commend him, because whereas many of the European countries have not raised their voice, he has raised his voice and has set an example for what both his country and Europe should be doing. Let me say my basic theme is that if we look at the human rights situation, regrettably, the very negotiation of the JCPOA, let alone the actual agreement, that whole process and since has effectively obscured, marginalized, and even sanitized the massive domestic repression in Iran. We simply didn't pay attention to it. Conversely, and this is really the core of my remarks here today, conversely, it is the very massive domestic repression that should have served and should still serve to illuminate the dangers of a criminal regime in Iran becoming a nuclear power, and should also sound the alarm on the culture of impunity that has attended human rights violations in Iran, of which former Terzi's example of the 1988 massacre is a case study. In Canada, we have set aside, by a unanimous vote of all our parties in Parliament, September 1st each year as Iranian Political Prisoner Day, with its focus to be on the criminal assault of 1988, where thousands of Iranian dissidents were murdered, which has continued to be covered up, and worst of all, the culture of impunity. One dramatic case study. A leader in that assault and murder in 1988 was a person by the name Mustafa Pourmuhammadi. Well, Rouhani appointed him Minister of Justice in Iran. What more Orwellian inversion can you have than the person responsible for the massacre then becomes the presiding Minister of Justice in Iran? So the question then becomes, what should we do in the light of this framing or thematic approach? Number one, we have to make the question of human rights in Khamenei's Iran, I use that term to distinguish it from the people and publics in Iran who are otherwise the targets of that massive domestic oppression. We have to make that an organizing principle of our foreign policy with respect to Iran, as a matter of principle and policy, number one. Number two, we have to unmask and expose the critical mass of human rights violations in Iran. Otherwise, as I say, they become obscured, marginalized, or sanitized. And I'd like to recommend for Americans something that we've done in Canada, not because we've done it in Canada, but it was something that was supposed to have been done with the US, but hasn't yet gotten started here. Every year, for 6 years now, we have for 2 weeks, it was called, and still is, Iran Accountability Week. It's not just 1 week, it ended up 2 weeks, in which we focus on what I would call the five-fold Iranian threat, which we've been discussing today, but in particular focusing on the massive domestic repression. And within that, we also focus on the plight and pain of political prisoners in Iran. And our members of Parliament on the committee, Foreign Affairs Committee that considers it, are asked each one to adopt a political prisoner, to speak to that case and cause in Parliament, to write an op-ed in the leading newspapers. In other words, to expose and unmask that critical mass of human rights violations, and to expose as well the specifics of those violations. And with this, I close. And here's where we have to make specific demands. We have to become the plaintiff and not the indifferent bystander. And when I say the plaintiff, the claimant, we have to come with a series of claims which will frame the human rights issue and keep it at the forefront and call upon Iran, for example, to have a moratorium on the executions where it executes, and you've mentioned, Mr. Chair, executes more people per capita than any other country in the world. Call for the release of political prisoners. You mentioned Baha'i woman, one of the Yaran group. There still are 7 others that are imprisoned, and I have to tell you that at the start of every General Assembly, year after year, Rouhani has released a political prisoner, somehow to deflect away from all the other political prisoners that remain in prison and brutalized and tortured in detention. We have to call for their release. We have to call for the ceasing and desisting of torture in detention. We have to call, as I've been mentioning, for an end to the culture of impunity, and in effect for the criminalization of the fundamental freedoms in Iran, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, assembly and association, where people's speech is not only being silenced, but they are being imprisoned with respect to that speech. And I'll mention just one example, because it's a horrific case study, and it's not known, and it deserves to be known. There is a great human rights hero in Iran, Ayatollah Bourjedi. He is now in 11th year of imprisonment, much of it with torture in detention. What has been his crime? He has spoken up in Iran on behalf of freedom of religion and freedom of speech. He has spoken up on behalf of separation of religion and state. He has spoken up on behalf of other religious minorities in Iran. He has condemned publicly anti-Semitism, etc. We need to stand up for the Bourjedis in Iran who are really standing up for all the values that we care about, and we have to call upon the international community to make holding Iran accountable a central pillar of our country's foreign policy and our international advocacy.
I just want to remark that a very recent report came out that 15 Baha'is were among 53 prisoners who were just transferred to a high-security prison west of Tehran, and they're all on a hunger strike. And this situation has been going on for a quite long time. I'd like to introduce Ambassador Wolcott and
Thank you.
wait for her remarks.
I'm going to be a little less legal, although I totally agree with my two preceding speakers, and talk a little bit about my own experience in the United Nations largely. And first, I want to say one thing I learned over time is that countries that'll cheat on one treaty are likely to cheat on others as well. And I think Iran is a great example of that. As I went through various meetings of the Third Committee, the General Assembly, the IAEA, the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, the UN Security Council, I'm sure I'm missing some, Iran was always one of the main focus points. So when, some years ago, I left the government and then went to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom first as its executive director and now as a commissioner, I was actually right at home, unfortunately, with Iran and its serial cheating. And another thing that I learned over the years is that proliferators are persecutors. And you can think of a lot of countries, and ones that jump to mind are China, Pakistan, North Korea. Well, Iran's in quite a club. A lot of folks today have had the opportunity to talk about basic statistics of how many people have been executed, imprisoned, and I won't do that now, but I wanted to mention the USERF, and the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedoms acronym is USERF. And I'm not here representing them today, but the commission is mandated by Congress, and Senator Kirk and Senator Lieberman were involved in the creation of this commission by Congress in 1998. Is mandated to report to Congress every year about the state of religious freedom around the world and give policy recommendations. And in 2017, in May, when we issued our report, Iran again was recommended by USERF as a country of particular concern. And the actual language, and now I will be legal, the actual language in the statute is that these are countries that have systematic, ongoing, and egregious religious freedom violations. The State Department just last month confirmed that position, and since 1999, again, has named it in that category, which is the worst one under this law, and can elicit sanctions and various other things. As you know, the religious minorities are very much persecuted in Iran. The Baha'is, Sunni Muslims, Christians, the Jews aren't doing too well either. And this has only increased since the JCPOA, which I think is something that we all have to remember. I wanted to put a face for a moment to those religious minorities and mention one particular pastor, a Christian pastor of a 400-person house church. Many of you who follow Iran will probably know his name, Pastor Yusuf Nadarkhani. He's actually prisoner of conscience that I adopted as a USERF commissioner to advocate for in a variety of ways. And I am happy to have this opportunity to do so today. And his crimes, he started being arrested in 2006, essentially for crimes of apostasy and evangelism. And he was sentenced to a death penalty by hanging in 2009. There were 2 years that went by after that, and his case got some publicity in the international community. And it was only after an outcry from the United States government, the EU, the UN, and many countries I could name, that the Iranians released him. And I think that's important to note too. They claim to not care about condemnation or resolutions against them, but they're always lobbying against, as aggressively as possible, against these things. And I want to mention the Iranian Baha'i who was released yesterday, is my understanding. They weren't really doing her a great favor. She finished her 10-year sentence, so some of the other Baha'i sentences are also coming up for completion, and hopefully they will respect that and release them. Pastor Nadarkhani has again been sentenced July 6th to 10 years in prison. This was for basically his professing his Christian faith and having a house church. 10 years in prison and 2 years in exile. He's not in prison yet, and we're working to hopefully get him from going again to prison. But this is repeated, and this is just one person, and the numbers are staggering, and they're going up instead of down after the JCPOA. I think, and that's important to note because, as Ambassador Terzi said, there are countries, and some even in the European Union, that just want to do business with Iran. And those who are optimistic about the JCPOA or just don't want to, it's inconvenient to say what's going on with the JCPOA. It's really hard to ignore the human rights situation. Hanging people from cranes, for instance. So a country that will do that to its own people, I mean, we're not even talking about the foreigners and the dual nationals, is one that we really can't trust. And I think that is a point we have to apply to what's going on with the JCPOA and how the human rights situation is getting worse and not better. UANI has been really on the forefront of flagging what the consequences are of doing business with Iran, and I really admire that work. And just finally, again, the idea that proliferators are persecutors, I think that's something that we should always flag because I think a lot of countries want to avoid the inconvenient fact that Iran has never been serious about its obligations under international treaties or conventions or just simple agreements like the JCPOA. And whether we have a JCPOA or not, Iran remains a proliferator and a persecutor. So I think with that, I'll close and look forward to some questions. Thank you.
Before I take questions from the audience, I'd like to ask our guests several questions. This is an open one. What about the plight of dual nationals visiting Iran? Should businesses send employees who have dual nationality to Iran? What are the risks?
Well, I can speak to a particular situation of a dual national Canadian-Iranian. Actually, by the name of Saeed Malikpour. As we're meeting, he's in his 9th year of imprisonment. I wouldn't exactly say dual in the sense that he was a permanent Canadian resident on the path to citizenship, went to visit his ill family in Iran, and was then arrested, trumped up charges, imprisoned, etc. And I think that we have to make it a particular part, again, of our negotiations that Iran can't get a pass because in the manner in which they focus on dual nationalities by erasing the nationality of the American or Canadian or European part of that citizenship, declare them to be Iranian citizens only, subject only to the exclusive jurisdiction of Iran, and then this becomes part of this ongoing culture of impunity. So I think here too we have to unmask and expose, and I think, as you mentioned, Ambassador Wallace, you probably put it, proliferators, persecutors. It's really a set of P's that involves what the Iranian government is doing today.
Ambassador.
But there is more than an impression. It's almost a certainty that the human rights are played by the Iranians against us. And not the leverage goes vice versa. Instead of having a conditionality on our side, which is a legitimate, not only a legitimate conditionality, but an obligation according to the international instrument and regimes which exist in human rights and which have been ratified over the decades by almost everybody in the international community, 90% of the countries in the international community. The Iranians are using a sort of a threat with foreign nationals, or at least persons who are also foreign nationals, the dual national, in making certain their safety and their freedom once they cross the border of their country, of their country of which they are nationals. We have also had some cases, prominent nuclear researchers who have been working for years and years in Italy, was an Italian citizen and working also in Belgium. He had come back many times to his country, and after June 2015, after the date, the conclusion of JCPOA, he came back a few months after, and he was arrested and put in high security jail, and now he's risking his life. There is not a cause and effect situation which can be proven, but that is the general environment which has been created by the JCPOA, not directly on human rights, but for sure in separating so clearly the aspect of nuclear proliferation from all the other aspects of Iranian behavior worldwide and in the country. It has created a situation where the regime feels hands-free in increasing the repression with all the means, individually and on categories which are faith or ethnic minorities. We have not talked about the Kurdish situation. It is also a very bad, a quite bad situation. And the Baha'i, again, they have been deported from one jail to the other with clear harassment and a very bad situation.
1/5 of those who were executed happened to be Kurds. Ambassador Wolcott?
Well, I agree with what's been said. Why do they do it? Because they can. Because we don't, as you sort of said, we haven't included human rights and these kind of violations in the bigger negotiations. One report from the Congressional Research Service from last month by an expert didn't really know the answer why also that they let dual nationals go at JCPOA implementation time, and then they arrested a bunch more, suggesting perhaps that it's a leverage of some sort. I don't know, but I think that they have successfully been able to do these things without much, having to pay any price.
Just today, the UN reported again that they talked about the Namazi family again, both father and son, who were sentenced to 10 years in prison, and they have been complaining to Iran about that. I sometimes wonder if it's an internal dispute within Iran, between the IRGC and Rouhani, and that, I don't know, is something up in the air. Does anybody have any opinion about that?
Well, I think that Rouhani is very often characterized as a moderate and even sometimes as being in opposition to the hardline Khamenei. But when you get right down to it, as president, he initially said that he would promote and protect human rights.
Yes.
He would secure equal citizenship. And in fact, he has been responsible. He presides over 9 ministries. It's the president, not Khamenei, presides over 9 ministries that are themselves complicit and responsible for major human rights violations, amongst them the intelligence ministry and the like. So I don't think we should be giving Rouhani a free pass by characterizing him as a moderate or saying that he's not really responsible because it's Khamenei. I think we need to call him to account as well. And one of the things, and references, you both made reference to the question of accountability. The United States has passed the Global Justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation. That is intended to hold those who engage in major human rights violations accountable. We may not be able to do anything about the culture of impunity in Iran, but we should certainly be able to impose visa bans on these human rights violators here in the United States or Canada, which also is about to pass such legislation. We should certainly ensure that they can't launder their assets in our countries. In other words, we need to take seriously a sanctioning of the human rights violators in Iran and put them on notice that they will be held accountable.
The Trump administration has sought to downplay the role of human rights in the conduct of U.S. foreign policy, generally viewing them as separate and subordinate to the pursuit of U.S. interests. Can the U.S. meaningfully push back at Iran's human rights abuses if it has shown reticence to politically call for greater reforms on part of our allies who have less than perfect human rights records? I open that up to the panel.
I know the press is saying that a lot, and probably with some reason, but the president has said many things about human rights actually over time in different situations, and he's certainly raised the treatment of the Iranian people by the Iranian government. Ambassador Haley has been very, very vocal, and of course, and Secretary Tillerson had, but there aren't that many people in jobs right now, so you can only look to the ones that are there. And I think that the jury's still out on how much attention they're going to give to human rights. But I do know that they have all, in one place or another, mentioned the treatment of Iran and treatment of Iran toward its people.
Ambassador?
The speech this morning at General Assembly, the President referred to the question in Iran, but more in general terms, the issue of human rights, fundamental freedom, democracy came up very strongly, not only about Iran, but also other countries, especially Venezuela, where he was very firm in pinpointing the stealing of democratic process from Maduro in Venezuela to his own people. So in a way, just maybe is exaggerated to mention Venezuela just because in Venezuela there is a strong presence of Hezbollah, a very big influence in recycling of money, drug trafficking, and so on. And the vice president of Maduro, appointed a couple of months ago, is very close to the Hezbollah, well known for having business activities with Hezbollah. But in fact, that shows that the concern on human rights and fundamental freedoms is there and is an issue which has been raised just a few hours ago by the president. But I would like to, on question on accountability, is an enormous problem for the Western world and for our rights and for our vision of international relations, the question of accountability. And I believe we spoke about 1988 massacre. And to see and then quoting a document which was submitted by the Human Rights Association of Women to the Council of Human Rights just a few days ago, to see a list of members of the highest Iranian institutions, of people who were members of the death committee, not only the justice minister, which was quoted just before, but also at least other 6 persons. Ibrahim Raisi, member of the State Expediency Discernment Council. Hussein Ali Nayeri, head of the Supreme Disciplinary Court. Ali Razini, vice president of the Judiciary on Legal Affairs. Salman Khodadadi, member of parliament and chair of the Committee of Social Affairs. Mohammed Hosseini Ahmad Sharoudi, member of the Assembly of Experts. Golareza Kalalzare, Supreme Court judge. All elements, all members of the Red Committee in 1988. So this is a scandal, quite frankly. It's a scandal that these names are circulated only of course, in an official document of the United Nations, but who knows about this document? Where is the press, the democratic press of our countries, in avoiding to speak about this issue, about an issue of such importance? Whenever it rises, the same press, the same media, they write constantly about the beautiful opportunities on the Iranian market, the need for European companies to rush there and to make a lot of money, now that the sanctions are not there anymore. I mean, this is a big issue of conscience that I think the Western media should have more in front of their eyes.
Attorney General Cotler.
Just to comment on the last point, I think the people who've been named and we don't know about them should also now be sanctioned, and maybe we would learn more about it. And so we would give it a higher level of importance and accountability by sanctioning them with all the appropriate fallout that such sanctions would have. And when I mentioned the Global Justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation, that was a congressional initiative. So I have to say, in terms of the American system, you've got separation of powers, even if the president, whoever that president may be, may not be moving forward as compellingly as one might wish. Congress, which is accountable and the like, can be called upon with regard to pursuing that sanctions regime. And I would also mention that, every year there's an annual resolution at the General Assembly. I know that these resolutions may not mean anything, etc. But the fact is that the annual resolution on the human rights situation in Iran, regrettably, has never referenced the 1988 massacre. And so it's, again, we've been giving a blank check to Iran. And I would like to see this year's resolution, which among others is co-sponsored by Canada and the United States, finally include express reference to the 1988 massacre, to the need for accountability, to the combating of impunity, and to the sanctioning of those perpetrators involved.
Maybe we can... Perhaps we can return to a question about the current appetite of American and European legislators to pursue sanctions targeting human rights in Iran. Maybe we can discuss that one. Ambassador Terzi.
Yes, as I mentioned briefly, there is a movement and I would say an increased awareness in the European Parliament and in some national parliaments in Europe about these issues, not only the massacre of 1988, but more in general, the question of human rights in the different segments that we have discussed today. And I'm confident that this snowball will produce effects in the future, but it is a very delicate balance between the activity of the parliaments and the European Parliament and the position that has been taken in the same vein by the European governments. There is a split between the sensitivities in Parliament and the interest of governments, which seem to be willing to promote economic interest and neglect the other issues. This is still an awareness which has not gained traction among the leaders of the governments in Europe.
Ambassador Wolcott?
I'm sorry. I don't have anything more to say about that.
Attorney General?
Actually, I do want to say one thing.
Okay.
I was going to withhold it. You know, the Europeans, in my experience of the Security Council resolutions that were the beginning of the Iran Security Council resolutions, 2005, 2006, 2007, I think. In a way, they had to be brought kicking and screaming into those resolutions. And thanks to countries like Canada and Australia at the IAEA board, that's where we really got support. And I think all the effort that went into getting those sanctions resolutions and the years that just all got thrown away with the JCPOA, it's just, I don't even know, that's why I didn't say it. I don't even know what to say about it, except for I think countries are realizing, with North Korea out there and Iran doing what it continues to do no matter what, that maybe they do have to take another look at what's going on there. And maybe, I don't know what the answer is exactly. And you've got a lot of experts here today, and John Bolton's coming next, so I'm sure he'll have ideas on what to do about the JCPOA specifically. But I just think we have really gone backwards on the gains we made in the international community, to both on the Iran portfolio, and because Iran now has all that money, and you know, it's got a lot of support from Russia and others around the world. It's going to be a hard challenge to try to get it back into any semblance of, if it ever was. But we have to go, you know, start going forward again, I think.
Attorney General, do you have anything to say about that?
Well, I wanted to make mention of just one other topic, because I'm afraid it's within the thematic framework of both the culture of impunity and accountability, and it doesn't always get the express reference that it deserves. I'm speaking about the state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide in Khamenei's Iran. We may not recall that the 21st century began on January 3rd, 2000, with Khamenei saying there can be no resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict without the annihilation of the Jewish state. Didn't even use the euphemism, the Zionist entity, without the annihilation of the Jewish state. That kind of incitement has continued with ongoing reference to Israel as a cancerous tumor. And just yesterday, a military leader in Iran speaking also about the disappearance of Israel, about Tel Aviv and Haifa being ground into dust. I mention all this because it seems to me that we are not bringing up the issue of legal accountability here. Now, sometimes when I talk to my American colleagues, they'll say, well, you know, First Amendment doctrine protected speech. Now, even under the First Amendment doctrine, not all speech is protected speech. Perjury is not protected speech. Child pornography is not protected speech. Even misleading advertising is not protected speech. Certainly incitement to hate and genocide not only should not be protected speech, but there's been, in fact, a recent Supreme Court judgment in Canada, which I think we could rely upon because of its international resonance and importance, presidential, which said that the very incitement to genocide constitutes the crime, whether or not acts of genocide follow. The very incitement constitutes the crime. So what we're finding is that the Iranian regime is engaging regularly in crimes against humanity through that incitement to genocide, and we are not calling them to account, and it's time that we did.
I think, Ambassador, you have the last word.
Security Council, you mentioned very eloquently the story of the human rights Iran in Security Council. Unfortunately, the Security Council, for the presence of a non-aligned movement and as well Russia and China, which are not very enthusiastic about human rights, has deliberated as little as it could have done historically on human rights. The only thing that he appears more frequently over the last couple of years in Security Council resolutions is the rule of law. The countries must respect the rule of law, where human rights are evidently included. So I think it's a duty for Western countries to press more on this issue. Thank you.
I'd like to thank everybody on the panel for today's discussion. It was very stimulating and I think very, very important. Thank you very, very much.